Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar on the Department of Labor's final overtime rule. This free webinar is available exclusively for our customers enrolled in our subscription services. I'm Leon Frierson, the Regulatory Coordinator for Personnel Concepts, and I'm joined by my co-moderator, Rosie Merlan, who serves as our Senior Regulatory Researcher.
Hello to all our attendees. I'd like to welcome Christopher Ray back as our guest speaker. Some of you may remember Christopher from our webinar in July addressing various DOL proposed regulations. Now he is here to review the DOL's final overtime rule with us today. Christopher is a Boston-based attorney licensed in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Mr. Ray began his career as an in-house counsel for a large Denver-based technology company, working mainly on employment matters, data privacy issues, and contract matters. Since going into private practice, he has served on both the employer and employee sides of litigation matters, including litigation before the EEOC. He also provides regulatory compliance guidance for businesses in high-risk verticals such as cryptocurrency and the legal adult use cannabis industry. In partnership with a PHR certified HR professional, he also provides compliance training, ERISA plan design consultation, risk management, and employment law guidance to employers not currently in active litigation. He received his JD from Suffolk University Law School, graduating with distinction in an elective concentration in labor and employment law. Thank you, Christopher, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Rosie. As always, I'm looking forward to talking about today's topic of the DOL's final overtime rules, which I'm sure most of the audience has been following pretty closely. Some of the audience may have been with us for our previous seminar on this topic where we discussed the proposed rule. So for their benefit and for everyone's benefit, I'm going to lean a little bit into explaining what the differences are that came out of the final rule that may not have been stated in the proposed rule that we discussed in our last seminar. I think it's an important area of law that's certainly going to affect pretty much every employer.
Yes, definitely. We're looking forward to discussing it with you. Today's agenda focuses on providing an overview of the final overtime rules. We will begin with a look at the current overtime rules. Christopher will then discuss the main provisions of the final rules, including salary thresholds, non-discretionary bonuses, and catch-up payments. We will then examine potential legal challenges. Finally, Christopher will go over tips on what employers can do to prepare for the final rules, which will be effective January 1st, 2020. At the end, we'll address questions submitted by our listeners.
And the format for today's webinar features a series of questions that I'll be asking to Christopher regarding the final overtime rules. Before we begin, I want to invite everyone in attendance to submit any questions you may have during the presentation by using the Ask Question feature in GoToWebinar. You can also post questions in the question window. Most questions will be saved for the end of today's session, but those that are relevant to the subtopic being discussed will be posed where appropriate. At the end of today's session, you'll have an opportunity to use the raise hand feature in GoToWebinar to pose a question directly to our guest speaker. And with that, let's get started with today's presentation.
Christopher, most employers have probably been following the news about the upcoming overtime rule. Could you give us a quick update of the status of this rule?
Sure, Rosie. So the DOL first issued its notice of proposed rule changes in March of this year. The notice and comment period ran through May, and then in response to some of the comments that the Department of Labor received, the final rule that came out in late September of this year was a little bit different. There were some changes to some of the numbers that we'll talk about as part of the salary caps and salary minimums, but much of the main structure of the rule remained the same, from the proposed rulemaking in March to the final rule that was published just a few months ago. So just by way of summary, I think that the most important changes for most employers include some changes to the numbers that are used to determine whether or not somebody falls into the salary level exemption from overtime. There have been some additional features to the rule, the most important of which for our purposes, I think, are these annual catch-up payments that are now allowed under this rule. And there have been a couple of changes to the kinds of compensation that you as an employer can use to determine whether or not somebody falls within that salary range for exemption from overtime. For many employers, this will not necessarily mean an actual change. It just means a clarification of the existing rule. But for other employers who may be in states or jurisdictions where the case law hasn't quite sorted those issues out yet, this rule at least grants some clarity as to those issues. You know, what do I do with commission payments? What do I do with bonuses? And finally, the effective date of this rule is January 1st of next year. So just a few weeks from now, coming up pretty quickly. But we're going to talk about how this catch-up payment feature of the rule gives employers a little bit of breathing room if they think that there might be some issues getting their compliance in order just in the next few weeks.
Okay, so I would like to do our first poll for attendees. What is your biggest obstacle in regards to the new overtime rules? Having a general understanding, gathering the necessary data to audit and make changes, documenting any changes this will cause, or smooth sailing, no obstacles here? And we'll give everyone a few moments to answer that. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. And let's share our results. So it looks like, okay, it looks like having a general understanding and smooth sailing obstacles here are the main response there.
All right, with a lot of our audience members looking for a general understanding, it's an excellent opportunity for us to provide that today, Christopher. But before we do, could you review for us what the current overtime rule requires before we get into what's going to change in the new year?
Sure, Leon. So the current overtime rule, in many ways, the big picture is not changing in the final rule, which is kind of nice. But as I'm sure most of you know, the current basis for calculating overtime pay and for determining who's eligible for overtime is based on numbers that were published in 2004. And the rule itself comes from the text of the Fair Labor Standards Act and has been in effect for decades. Typically, in most circumstances, an overtime payment is 1.5 times the base rate of pay for hours worked in excess of 40 hours per week. And this big picture is not really changing much. Some state laws vary this up a little bit. Those of us who practice in California, New York, places like that may be subject to a little bit of variation in the big picture here. But generally speaking, the rule applies to workers who both work more than 40 hours in a given week or more than 80 hours in a given pay period. In some places, it's more than 10 hours or more than 12 hours in a given day. And then you take the base rate of pay divided by the number of hours, multiplied by 1.5, and that is your overtime rate of pay. And these state laws do vary things up a little bit, but it continues to be the case that neither state law nor a private agreement can agree to diminished protections under these overtime rules. And then there's the exemption from overtime concept. The exemption from overtime concept, which also is changing a little bit, but not in its major contours in the final rule. Workers may be exempt from overtime payments if they are both in a category of job duties that's eligible for the exemption. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about what those job duties are a little bit later, and if the employee meets a minimum salary threshold. And again, the numbers that constitute that threshold are changing a little bit, but the job duties test itself is not being modified very much at all by the final rule. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what those salary thresholds are. So under the current rule from the 2004 guidance and the one that's in place right now, the minimum salary level required is about $455 per week, which works out to about $23,500 a year. So that's sort of, you can think of that as the low end, as what I'll call the floor of this test. On the other side, there's the ceiling of the test for highly compensated employees who, generally speaking, are not eligible for overtime. As always, there are some exceptions, but somebody who falls within that HCE number, which right now is just $100,000 flat, are generally not going to be exempt from overtime. So with that, let's do a quick review of the job duties categories that are required as a component of the exemption, together with the salary range. So the job duties test exempts people who are executives, certain kinds of administrative professionals, people in quote unquote learned professions. That means people like doctors, attorneys, people who generally require some specific credential to do their job. Outside salespeople are included in this exception, and certain computer professions are also included in this exception. Certain jobs in governmental, or what I'll call quasi-governmental roles, generally are also exempt. These quasi-governmental roles often refer to things like EMTs or other first responders who, their formal employer may be a private organization, but they serve in a highly regulatory capacity, where their day-to-day functions are generally governed by a government employee or by a very specific set of government responsibilities. And so, as we said earlier in the talk, these job duty categories are not changing very much at all. The quasi-governmental roles that are covered are clarified a little bit in the final rule, but the job duties test itself is not being modified very much. I think that for those of us who practice in this area as compliance professionals, it has been a little bit frustrating for us because we've been hoping to see a little bit of clarity around things like what constitutes a computer professional. When the rule first came out, when these rules were first being set forth in the 80s and 90s, and then even in the 2004 rule, it wasn't so much the case as it is today that virtually everybody uses a computer for their job, and where we now think of a computer professional as an IT person, a developer, a programmer, there's still no specific rule that delineates what constitutes a computer professional, say, or an administrative professional. We're still left to rely on case law, and so some of that frustration is going to continue to exist under this rule that we're discussing. But let's go forward and talk about how the job duties test works with the exemption. And so it's not merely the case that an employee who meets the job duties test is exempt. These salary thresholds that we discussed are part of the same exemption test. So the exemption test requires that somebody sort of fall within the exemption range that we had discussed between the floor and the ceiling, and to meet a job duties test in order to be exempt. So if somebody is outside of that salary range, if they fall below that floor, they will generally not be exempt from overtime regardless of their job duties. And somebody who is above that threshold, somebody who's in the HCE range, generally will be exempt from overtime regardless of their job duties as well. So that's sort of a band of salaries you can see where we have to do both the job duties test and a compensation test to determine whether or not somebody is eligible to be exempt from overtime. Somebody who's below that floor generally will not be exempt. Somebody who is above that floor generally will be exempt. If they're in between, you got to run your job duties test in parallel.
Okay, Christopher, could you give us a general overview of the 2020 overtime rule?
Sure, Rosie. So the effective date of this rule, as we said, is January 1st. As with any kind of DOL rulemaking, it's not retroactive. You don't have to worry about any payments that were made prior to January 1st, 2020. That being said, if you're an employer who has a pay period that sort of straddles the 2019-2020 calendar year, maybe your last check date was December 22nd, and your next check date is January 5th or 6th, then the individual days that fall after January 1st will be covered by the rule, and days that occurred in 2019 will not be covered by the rule. So the rule is effective as of any pay that occurs on or after January 1 of next year. So there's no, unlike other DOL rules, however, there's no differing compliance or reporting requirements for small businesses. So those of us who practice a lot, for example, in ACA compliance, are pretty familiar with things like workforce size counts, head count thresholds, having more or fewer than 50 employees mattering a lot. For purposes of this rule, however, the head count doesn't really matter. A single employee, 1,000 employees, the workforce is going to be covered, and everybody who falls under normal W-2 payments is going to be covered regardless of size. And so let's talk a little bit about the specific changes that are going to be made under the final rule. So most importantly, I think, especially for people who are, for example, payroll professionals, the salary thresholds are being adjusted both on the minimum and and on the HCE end. So the baseline number is rising considerably. It's rising to around $35,000 a year, and the HCE cap, that highly compensated employee cap, that ceiling number, is also being revised upward. One major change that I want to highlight from the proposed rule to the final rule is that the proposed rule set a much higher number for the highly compensated employee threshold. The proposed rule set that number at around $145,000 to qualify as an HCE, whereas the final rule that came out set that number at just $107,000. So a much smaller increase in the HCE cap, proportional to the increase that we see on the lower end of that test. There's also a new tool for measuring what kinds of compensation and how much of that compensation may contribute to determining these thresholds. And we'll go into more detail about what this means. This means a lot, for example, for people who have a large commission-based sales structure, for example, or who issue production bonuses, that kind of thing. More detail on that in a minute. There's a second tier of exemptions that is created under this final rule. As I said earlier, this speaks mainly to people who are employed in these quasi-governmental roles. So, if you're somebody who, is maybe you're an ambulance dispatcher, or if there are private fire services in your community, these kinds of exemptions are clarified and defined in more detail in the final rule. And finally, one point of note, again, mainly for payroll professionals and HR people, is that the rule provides that there's going to be periodic mandatory adjustments to these salary levels. So instead of having to wait, 15 plus years for a new round of rulemaking to see some adjustments in these rules, the final rule proposes that every 2 years, the federal government is going to publish new numbers that will constitute both the floor and the ceiling for the exemption test. So every 2 years, you're just going to have to go back to the Department of Labor website, and they're going to publish it prominently, so they tell us, to just see how they are adjusting these numbers. The adjustments are going to be based on some complex macroeconomic factors like GDP and change CPI. These are very standard macroeconomic numbers that are used for measuring wage inflation and wage growth, that kind of thing. And the idea behind the rule is that they're going to require that these salaries more or less track big picture changes in wage averages nationwide, without real regard for specific industries or that kind of thing. So with that, let's go to a poll.
Okay, so we have our second poll. How many of your employees will be affected by the new overtime rules? More than 10, between 6 to 10, between 1 to 5 employees, none, or you are unsure and you are still needing or are working on an audit. Okay, we have a lot of responses coming in, so we'll give that a few more seconds here. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. And seems like most of you are unsure. You are still working on an audit.
Good results there. Thank you for that, Rosie, and also the audience members. And we've been actually getting a few questions about specific rates. One from Denise. She asked if 33.5 would be exempt. So if you don't mind, Chris, could you review the new salary thresholds for us under the new rule and what that will look like for employers moving forward?
Denise, thanks for giving us the perfect segue question. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what these thresholds are going to be. So I'll talk about what the thresholds are that are set at the federal level, and remind everybody that there are a couple of state level rules that modify these numbers slightly. We'll go into some more nuance on that a little bit later. We'll talk specifically about California, where many of you practice, New York as well. But for right now, the new thresholds being adjusted upwards to $684 per week, which works out to about $35,000 per year as the floor level of this test. Now, there are some exceptions. Special numbers have been published for many U.S. territories. Every U.S. state is going to fall within this number, but many U.S. territories like Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, Mariana Islands, Samoa, etc., are subject to special rates Each of these territories has their own rates that are set. So, for example, the rates in Guam are a little bit closer to 400 per week. The rates in the Virgin Islands are a little bit closer to 300 per week. All of these numbers are published on the Department of Labor's website, and even these special numbers that were published are themselves subject to the 2-year adjustment. So if you have any of your workforce located in these territories that you're concerned about, you will want to go and just check the special numbers that were published for them, and also just be conscientious of the fact that those numbers will also be adjusted on a biannual basis, the same as the federal number that applies to the states is. It's also a special rule for the motion picture industry that was published. I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that virtually that entire industry is covered by a comprehensive collective bargaining agreement, and their lobbying efforts are pretty successful. So if you happen to have any workforce in that particular industry, they're generally going to be subject to a completely separate set of rules that are going to be governed by the master collective bargaining industry set by the Screen Actors Guild. That doesn't really apply to most people, but then we have a lot of Californians on here, so maybe. There's also, as I said, some adjustments to the salary cap for what determines a highly compensated employee. Just to highlight for people who are with us for our last webinar on this subject, again, we discussed in our last webinar that number was looking to be around 145,000 per year. That's been revised downward substantially, and we'll talk a little bit more later about why that might be the case. But it's been set at 107,432 per year, and again, there's going to be a little bit of state level variation here that we'll go into more detail on later on. Finally, and most importantly, the test expressly does not modify the job duties test. Except for talking a little bit about the quasi-governmental roles that don't affect that many people. For all private employers, the rule is very specific in stating that it is not modifying the job duties test in any way. As I said before, there are some reasons that this is a bit frustrating for compliance professionals. It doesn't give some of the clarity that we've been looking for on some of these job duties or job categories. But the good news is that it at least doesn't give us a new compliance test that we have to run on, who's doing what job at what time.
Okay, thank you for reviewing that information with us. You mentioned that under this final rule, there is a new tool for measuring compensation. Would you mind giving us more details on that?
Sure, Rosie. So, one thing that was sort of left to the courts to work out, and that many people may see as one of the more frustrating state-by-state nuances, is that it's not always obvious what kinds of compensation can be used to determine whether or not somebody falls within a salary threshold for exemption purposes. So if somebody just gets, they get 36,000 a year, and here's how that breaks down to their hours. It's pretty straightforward. But what do you do with things like commission? What do you do with things like quarterly bonuses? What do you do with bonuses that you sort of give out whenever the board's in a good mood, but that are not mandatory? These kinds of more exotic compensation that can vary from day to day, and that even more vexingly, if you have somebody who's under a complex commission structure, you may not actually know whether or not that person is going to earn enough money to be a highly compensated employee or to get over a salary threshold until you're 6, 7, 10, or 12 months into the year. So the final rule provides now that any of these non-discretionary bonuses or incentive payments, as long as they're paid at least annually, may be used to satisfy up to 10% of the salary thresholds. So we've got this non-discretionary concept, but unfortunately the final rule does not go into great detail to define what constitutes non-discretionary. And I imagine that we're going to see a good amount of case law to clarify that over the next few years. But there are some examples of things that we can be pretty sure are not discretionary. I think that the most common example will be, salespeople who work under a written commission structure. For example, if you sell, product X, you're going to get a $100 commission on that sale. That kind of compensation is not discretionary in the sense that the salesperson is more or less guaranteed to get the commission as long as they make the sale. There's a contract or a quasi-contract like instrument, like a commission structure in place, which more or less requires the employer to give out that commission if it's earned by the salesperson. That kind of thing is a non-discretionary incentive. If you if you have an agreement with your employees where every holiday season everybody gets a full pay period's worth of extra compensation as a bonus, as long if it's part of a written plan that somebody signs when they sign up for work, then that also is a non-discretionary incentive. So the easy cases are these contract-like incentives, where they're more or less guaranteed as long as they're earned under the terms of a written agreement. Some of these kinds of compensation that may be a little bit less obvious, though, are, what do I do with, my business has given out a quarterly bonus every quarter for the last 50 years like clockwork. Every quarter we sit down, look at the production numbers, we give out a bonus to the floor workers based on that production. We've never guaranteed it to anybody. We've never issued a written agreement that says so. There's no collective bargaining agreement that requires us to pay this or anything else, but it's been issued on such a clockwork basis that everybody just expects it. Everybody just looks forward to that bonus because, they just assume that it's being offered to them. These are the more difficult cases, where you're going to have to really sit down and figure out, is it really up to us whether or not we issue this compensation? And in one of the compliance tips that we're going to go into later, I'm going to give you some ideas about how you can navigate these fuzzier kinds of compensation that it may not be obviously discretionary or non-discretionary. And as a final point, though, only 10% of these more exotic kinds of compensation, other than salary, can be used to count towards compensation. So, for example, if a salesperson earns $100,000 in commission in a given year, 10,000 of those dollars go into the determination of whether or not that person meets either the salary floor or the salary ceiling for exemption purposes. So it's not every dollar in these non-salary compensations. It's 10% tops that go into it.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. Let's do a poll to our audience on this type of compensation. Does your business pay non-discretionary bonuses such as commissions and quota bonuses to employees? Yes, no, and not sure. Okay, we have a lot of votes coming in. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. And it looks like, yes, most of you pay out commissions and quota bonuses. Oh, I'm sorry, no, most of you do not pay out commissions and quota bonuses to employees.
Thanks again for that, Rosie. And then, so Chris, before we move along, I am getting tons of questions here from our audience. So before, like I said, we get too far along, I just wanted to double back to one specifically, and I actually think I can answer this myself, but I wanted to get your confirmation on that. And I have Eddie G in the audience asks, are the salary threshold values based on gross or net wages? And I'll go out on a limb and say that it is based on gross wages, and I'll wait for you
Correct.
to confirm that. Right.
Yep, that's it. Yep, Leon. So that's always going to be your pre-tax amount that goes into these rules. And
Yes.
that's the feature that is not going to change from one state to another.
Perfect. Thank you. I just didn't want to get too far along before he got that answer because it is pretty important if you're not sure. But
of course,
using your examples of a salesperson that you discussed earlier, what if an employer can't tell what an employee will make for the year because of their salary varies depending on their performance? What type of tips would you have for an employer in that situation?
That is a great question, Leon. This was sort of a vexing issue for me back when I was in-house, because we had, and many of you may be familiar with this kind of compensation structure where, maybe one of your vendors or suppliers has a complicated commission or rebate structure, like an annual volume incentive, that kind of thing, where you don't actually know how much commission either you or your salesperson is going to earn until many months after the sale is closed, or even a year after the sales closes, or the end of the year, right? So maybe your salesperson gets a very small or even minimum wage base salary, but there's a commission structure where at the end of the year or the beginning of the next year, your vendor or supplier looks back over the volume that was sold and issues a bonus that may or may not push them over those thresholds, right? Whether that's over the HCE threshold or over the floor number on that. So, if you're in a position where you don't actually know how much money your employee is going to earn, where it's uncertain if an employee is going to earn enough money to get into an exemption or out of an exemption, there's this concept that's created called catch-up payments. These catch-up payments are also going to be useful for those of you who are sort of looking at the calendar and realizing that your first paycheck that is subject to this rule is due in just a few weeks, and you're a little bit worried that you may not be ready in time. You have this safe harbor of the catch-up payment, which is basically a feature of this rule where the Department of Labor has decided that if you have a good faith basis for the kind of ambiguity that we've discussed. You don't know how much money somebody's going to earn in the year until the year is over. You don't know for sure who's exempt or who's not based on a good faith ambiguity in the case law or in your local guidance or from the Department of Labor. They're going to give you a full calendar year after any of those payments are due to make what are called catch-up payments. Which is where, as long as you go back sometime in the following year, whether or not in response to a request or a challenge by an employee, if you go back and you determine that somebody had been due overtime for reasons that apply under this rule during the previous year, you can go ahead and make catch-up payments to that employee, and that will serve as the sole remedy for that employee for any underpaid overtime, meaning that as long as you go back and make these catch-up payments without any adjustments, there's no penalty, there's no interest, it's just the amount that they should have earned under this rule. You just didn't realize it until later. As long as you make these payments, the employee will have no further remedy against you under these rules, meaning that as long as you make these payments within the catch-up payment period, the employee is not going to be able to also sue you for any other damages that may arise. That's even in the more exotic cases of where, they should have gotten the overtime, but they didn't. And because they didn't have the overtime, they suffered some other damages. Maybe they couldn't afford, a mortgage payment or something. Those kinds of special damages will not apply. Sole remedy for that employee is going to be receipt of these catch-up payments, which will be in the actual amount that would have been due, no interest, no penalties. And this is going to apply to the prior year. So the first year that you're going to have to really think about looking back on is 2020. So your first catch-up payment year is going to be 2021. So if throughout 2020, you're not entirely sure if you're doing your overtime payments right because of some of the changes that this rule imposes, don't worry about it too much. Just have your compliance people look into these catch-up payments that they can make, and then make sure that you're prepared to make these catch-up payments within the time specified by the catch-up payment part of the rule, because this will prevent you from incurring any further liabilities that may arise as a result of this unpaid overtime.
Christopher, I know that there were some legal challenges to the 2016 version of the overtime rule. Do you foresee some of those same issues resurfacing?
Sure. So, some people may remember that a similar rule to this one was set forth back in 2016. That rule never went into effect. It was quickly stayed by the Fifth Federal Circuit in response to a challenge that had a little bit to do with how the 2016 rule calculated the highly compensated employee threshold. The way that those numbers were derived was part of that challenge, and this was never litigated to a final judgment. When the challenge arose, the Department of Labor just said, okay, we're going to put this whole thing on hold. We're going to sit down and revise our rulemaking and then try again, basically. I think this has a lot to do with why you saw that big difference between the proposed rule and the final rule's definition of a highly compensated employee, because I think that when they were doing the math, that they might have realized that that enormous jump was made as part of the kind of calculation that created a challenge to the 2016 rule. So the current version of the rule, we'll call it the 2020 final rule, does not have any of the features that were challenged for the 2016 rule. At this time, excuse me, at this time, there are no challenges in any court, at least that I'm aware of, against the 2020 rule. It's always possible that somebody will find a basis to challenge the rule. It covers virtually every employer, so there are plenty of potential plaintiffs out there. But this rule at least corrects for the features of the 2016 rule that were challenged in court. So I think that if you're going to find any avenues for a legal challenge to this rule, it's going to be in those 2-year adjustments. That's just my personal belief. That's not based on any active litigation right now. But if I was going to put money on it, I would say that if you're going to see any challenges, it would be to how the rule calculates, future adjustments to the salary minimums and the HCE numbers. But again, that's speculation on my part. At this time, there are no legal challenges to the 2020 version of the rule that I'm aware of.
Okay, and we have one more poll question for attendees based on the information we've covered so far. How are you planning to address employees whose current salary now falls under the new thresholds? We plan to raise their salary over the threshold. We plan to reclassify them as hourly, not sure, still deciding, or our approach will vary by employee. Okay, we still have some votes coming in, so we'll leave this open for another moment. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. Okay, and it looks like most of you are not sure, still deciding, followed by our approach will vary by employee there.
And thanks again for that, Rosie. Those results actually directly reflect the questions that we're getting in. So I want to encourage everyone that is asking questions to make sure you do stay to the end, because we're going to get some of these questions directly to our speaker. Hopefully we can even get 1 or 2 of you on the line to pose the question directly. That way you can have the questions about the thresholds answered that you need out there. But before we get into that, Christopher, do you have any recommendations for our listeners as to what they can do to prepare for the effective date of the final rule?
Sure. So we have some of these these compliance tips set up, which may answer some of your questions. And as Leon said at the beginning of this webinar, any questions that we don't get to during today's presentation, please just send those over to Personnel Concepts, and I will be happy to address those questions via email afterward if anyone still has, some things that they're confused about. So, obviously, the first most important tip is, sit down with your HR team, your compliance professionals, your in-house counsel or your general counsel, and, audit the current salaries, the current overtime exemptions, to determine who's affected. So as we said, the job duties test is not really changing. It's really those numbers that you're going to want to look at most carefully. Whether somebody is right on the border right now of either being above or below that sort of band of eligible salaries that we've been discussing. Those are the employees that you're going to want to look at first, especially people who, as I said, are, they're maybe at 30,000 or they're at 105,000. These are the people who you're going to want to look at first. And the second related tip is that for those employees who are, within those bands, the 30,000 a year employee, the 105,000 a year employee, who's going to be going from either non-exempt to maybe exempt, or from exempt to non-exempt, or vice versa on the higher end, you might want to determine whether or not giving that person, for example, a raise to keep them in the highly compensated employee range may actually be a good business decision. Number one, you want to pay your people fairly, but also it may make good business sense from a labor cost perspective. And if somebody right now earns $105,000 a year, say a 2.5–3% raise up to $108,000 per year may actually represent a savings over the overtime that they would earn as an employee who is otherwise eligible for overtime. So that, of course, one of our poll questions was an employee by employee case, you're going to want to make that determination pretty carefully. You know, every person is different, every situation is different, but you are going to want to examine whether or not it makes sense to either reclassify certain people by moving their job duties around, or to vary someone's compensation. Because if you think that somebody who's in that 105,000 a year job, you know, right now, you've been having them work 70, 80 hours a week because, you know, they're exempt. But now if they become eligible for overtime, and there's no easy way to shuffle around their work duties, it may actually make good business sense to give that person a raise. Because that may represent a net savings over the overtime that they would earn. And you know, as always, you know, we want to remind people to check the state-specific minimum exempt salaries. You know, as we said earlier in this talk, states are going to retain the right to adjust these rules a little bit. You know, not in a way that is less favorable than the federal rule to employees, but certainly in a way that is more favorable to employees. So, you know, as usual, people in California have a special regulatory regime that's pretty specific. So, you know, your salary cap is quite a bit higher. You know, it's going to be, you know, closer to 41 to 50,000 per year. And that is going to scale based on the workforce headcount that you're looking at. So every California employer, you know, is going to be looking at a salary threshold that's closer to 45,000 per year. And if you have 26 or more employees per year, that threshold is closer to 50,000. And you know, there are similar variations in the state rules for New York, and even within New York, that's going to vary depending on whether or not you're in the city, where your minimum number is about 58,000 per year, or whether you're in some of the more affluent counties of the state, where those numbers are looking at 43 to 46,000 per year. So as always, there's going to be local flavor to this rule, and I think that, you know, even in states that don't have these specific caps or minimums set for their exemptions, you're still going to see some local flavors about things like, you know, what determines eligible compensation, what constitutes a non-discretionary bonus, that kind of thing. So, you know, as always, just be mindful to be in conversation with your general counsel, your local counsel, because the federal rule, as always, sort of sets the broad contours of how this rule is going to work. But the states are always going to find ways, the states and the courts are going to find ways to vary things up a little bit, just make things a little bit more confusing for people who do business in those states. And so, you know, our fourth tip, you know, as always, is going to be to carefully consult with your counsel, with your HR professionals, whether that's an in-house or an outsourced team, before making any determinations if there's any ambiguity about an employee's overtime. You know, so, you know, your payroll person, whether they're in-house or outsourced, is generally going to be able to say, you know, this person does or does not fall within the exemption based on their salary. That's a fairly easy mathematical determination to make. But there's always going to be a little bit of ambiguity from the job duties test. So just make sure that before you go moving people in and out of exempt categories, that you are very clear with your in-house people who are looking at your state laws, people who are looking at these federal laws, to make sure that you are certain that you know whether or not the job duties part of the test also needs to be analyzed, or if the salary basis is itself sufficient to determine whether or not somebody is going to be exempt. That's particularly in light of this 10% rule for other kinds of compensation, where we've been talking about how it's not always obvious, you know, whether or not a kind of compensation is quote unquote discretionary, which leads into our next compliance tip, which is I want to go back to talking about that business that gives out a quarterly bonus or a holiday bonus, you know, like clockwork every year for decades. But they've never promised it to anybody, but they've just done it with such regularity in the same amounts every year. It's always, you know, one pay period or 2 weeks or 40 hours worth of payment. We cut it to the employees like clockwork, and everybody expects it, because you are going to want to sit down to determine whether or not it might make sense to just go ahead and clarify, just set down for your employees and say, okay, we are going to just clarify that our annual bonus is in the amount of one full pay period worth of compensation, and we give it out to everybody who's been here for a year or longer. Something like that, where you can just sit down and eliminate this ambiguity. Because what I'm worried about is the case where the employer says something like, well, we give a Christmas bonus, but we've never promised it to anybody. It's fully discretionary in the sense that, every year the board sits down and has a vote about it. They just always happen to vote yes on it. But from the employee's perspective, the employee might say, well, wait a minute. I've come to rely on this bonus. I've come to expect it. I'm doing my personal financial planning. I'm doing my estimated taxes. I'm representing to my mortgage lender or to consumer lenders that this is my income based on my expectation of this holiday bonus. And if that issue went before a court, it's not obvious to me which way that would go. Is it discretionary because the business technically takes a vote at the board level every year to issue it, but they always say yes? Or is it not discretionary because a quasi contract has been established by the employer creating a reasonable expectation in the employee of receiving this bonus? And so, it's these non-obvious cases where both sides of an argument would, I think, have a fairly good case to make that you're going to want to sit down and just say, look, we've done this every 20 years. Let's just put it in writing. Let's eliminate the ambiguity. That's going to help us with our overtime calculations. That's going to help us with our compliance. That's going to head off any potential litigation in the future. Or alternatively, sit down and look at these bonuses and make clear to everybody that we're not going to issue these bonuses every year. We're going to take a break every now and then at our discretion. But either way, resolving this ambiguity isn't going to be, in my opinion, the best way to forestall litigation or disputes or upset employees about this kind of thing by just adding a little bit of clarity to everybody's compensation. And next, again, as part of training your compliance personnel, just make sure that they're aware of the best ways to monitor future changes in this rule. If you get on the Department of Labor's email list, you're going to get a notification that's going to tell you when they're going to be publishing the revised numbers 2 years after 2020. Just make sure that everybody is aware of this, because those proposed changes to the salary floors and the HCE definitions are going to come every 2 years, and they're going to be effective January 1st every 2 years. So you just want to make sure that your team on the ground is ready to comply with these rules, right out of the gate. And so, our next compliance tip has more to do with your onboarding rules, where you want to make sure that a compensation structure is or is not discretionary, right? So for a salesperson, this kind of thing is pretty easy. You're going to get a commission structure, but you want to make sure that your onboarding documents, these quasi-contract documents, specify whether or not the commission structure can be varied with 1 week's notice, 2 weeks notice, no notice. Maybe somebody could walk in after their lunch break and the commission structure has changed, because you don't want to open yourself up to the possibility of a salesperson saying, oh, well, I thought this was the commission structure for the quarter or for the year, and so my commissions under that commission structure are non-discretionary. Just make sure that if you have any odds and ends in your compensation structure above and beyond what we've been discussing about these regular bonuses. I speak specifically about commissions just because that's a very common kind of variable compensation. But if you have any of these other kinds of variable compensation that might change from time to time, that might make business sense to adjust now and then, just make sure that it's clear at the level of your onboarding documents that everybody is aware that any of these kinds of commission can change at any time. And again, what I'm worried about are these sort of loose end, fuzzy at the corners cases where both sides would have a good argument to make that the kind of compensation that they're receiving is or is not discretionary, based on what the employer thinks is best for the business kind of discretion versus what the employee sees as a reasonable expectation kind of non-discretion. And so finally, compliance professionals should periodically review the publications that Personnel Concepts puts out, that the Department of Labor puts out, that are related to salary caps and salary floors for overtime pay. And it's very likely that as litigation arises under this rule and state and federal courts have the opportunity to more clearly define these concepts like non-discretionary pay, for example, or whether or not an employee should be reclassified based on a prospective estimate of that employee's compensation for the year. But just make sure that you're aware of how to stay on top of any clarity that we might see through litigation. The Department of Labor frequently publishes new guidance based on case law that the Department of Labor sees. They do a really good job of keeping people who are on their various mailing lists up to date on what the courts are saying, on what the EEOC is saying, and on any guidance that it itself issues.
All right. Well, thank you, Christopher, for reviewing that information with us. It was very helpful, I hope, to our audience. And before we end today's session, we're going to take a moment to answer some questions from our audience members that were submitted. In fact, we have two audience members that have agreed to come on live. And they have questions that I think will apply pretty widespread and could affect a large percentage of our audience. So, Yulia, if you're there, I want to go ahead and unmute you now. Yulia, are you there? Are you there with us? Is it Yulia? I don't have Yulia. It doesn't sound like I can hear her. I'll give her just a second. If not, I'll just go ahead and ask the question on her behalf. She asked, if employees get $20 an hour and they do a lot of overtime and it comes up to, let's say, more than $100,000 annually, do we have to transfer them to exempt? Thought that would be a good baseline question for everyone to understand, and hopefully, Yulia, you'll get the response you need today.
Sure. So one sort of trick to that question is that if somebody works a lot of overtime that happens to push them over that exemption number, it becomes a question for you is on January 1st, did you estimate that this person was going to be earning more than the HCE cap, or did they just happen to go over that threshold at some point during the year as a result of overtime that you weren't sure if they were? They were. So if one of your employees, they just regularly work that amount of overtime that's going to push them into that exempt category. And there are no other factors at play, as long as you've done your job duties analysis and all that other stuff to make sure that they fall into the exemption. And it may make sense to simply compensate that person in a way that you eliminate that uncertainty, because if somebody works at that rate and they're just making a ton of overtime doing that, but they're still being compensated on an hourly basis, then it's possible that it would be to the benefit of both the business from a labor cost perspective and to the employee from a certainty perspective to just put that person at a salary level that they're comfortable with and not have to worry about doing either any catch-up payments later on if you underestimate or overestimate how much overtime that person was going to work during the year, because that can put you in a position of having to set aside a significant chunk of money for a labor cost where businesses generally like to know what their labor cost is going to be basically in 2-week increments, as opposed to having to set aside large amounts of money for these mandatory catch-up payments. But nothing in the rule is going to require you to make that determination prospectively. So it may make better business sense for you to do it that way, but the rule is not going to require you, at least for the moment, pending any litigation in the future. The kind of reclassification that you ask about is not going to be mandatory, but as somebody who comes from the general counsel rule world, the difference between what's mandatory and what's merely a good idea is not always obvious. So I guess I would just recommend that in these hard cases like that, there's opportunity, for you as an HR person, where you're often thought of as a cost center, to really, show your bones as somebody who can save the business some money and do some good PR with your employees by doing this analysis to figure out if it may actually make better business sense to clarify somebody's compensation, maybe even if that involves giving them a large raise, because as opposed to the overtime that they would earn otherwise, it may actually save the business money and give the employee a feeling of certainty in their compensation that makes everybody happy. Great question though, and one where, as always, future changes in the rule and your local flavor may vary the wisdom of the answer to that question.
Thanks again, sir. And I think that was some great advice, especially as far as making your employees feel welcome and well compensated. I think that was some good advice for our audience today. And I want to go back to another audience member, see if we can get them on live. She has another good question. I believe it's Deetra or Deetra. Are
Yeah,
you there available?
Hi, Deetra.
Yes, we can hear
Hi,
you.
can you
Thank
hear
you.
me?
I sure
Okay,
can.
good deal. So it's a quick question. So is it accurate to say that regardless of if someone is full-time or part-time, if their salary is less than that $35,000 threshold, they're automatically non-exempt?
Right, yeah. So that feature of the test is not really changing much in the final rule. So if somebody is being compensated, whether it's on a salary or an hourly basis, that minimum, that floor sets a point, beneath which somebody is almost always going to have to earn overtime. There are a very small number of exceptions. For example, if you are the actual owner of the business, you're very rarely eligible for overtime payments. But for virtually everybody else, there's no distinction in the rule between full-time and part-time. The rule, the numbers that are published speak specifically to the compensation amounts, because those are our pre-tax amounts. But you're not going to have to worry about whether or not somebody is technically full-time or part-time. If they come in, 3 days a week, 5 days a week, 7.5 days a week for people like lawyers who work too much, that number itself is going to be the only piece that you're going to need to look at for that person. If they're below that, you should assume that they will receive overtime. Again, there are exceptions, but they are so few and far between that they're not going to apply, except in the really strong cases, like, again, if somebody is the actual owner of the business.
All right, and thank you. I just have time for one more question. I thought that was important. Just so for our audience to get a baseline of what's, the information that was passed on today. And I have Ernie asked from the audience, can you define HCE? That is the ceiling, and what does that mean? So if you could just give us a basic outline of HCE, some quick education for our audience on our way out.
Sure. Ernie, the HCE is the highly compensated employee, right? So this is somebody who right now earns $100,000 or more per year, or who under this rule is going to earn $107,000 or more per year. So that is somebody who is generally going to be exempt from overtime payments without regard to the job duties test. So whether or not somebody falls into one of the exempt job duties that we discussed, somebody who is in this highly compensated level will generally not be eligible for overtime. And again, this is now 107,000, counting 10% of their non-salary compensation. So if somebody earns, I'm doing some quick mental math here, if they earn, say, 102,000 in salary and 75,000 in commission, you add 10% of that 75,000 with the 7,500. 102,000 plus that 7,500 puts them over that $107,000 number, and they will be an HCE. And so once again, an HCE generally will not be eligible for overtime payments. One point that I do want to make here that I realize I might not have covered in this talk, though, is that even with your HCEs, nothing in the law forbids you from entering into a private contract with an HCE to provide them overtime. Maybe you have an HCE who is really important to the business, and even though they're getting paid a good amount of money, the work that they do is so valuable that you really got to have them there 70, 80 hours a week. But the employee says, yeah, but I got a life, I have family, I have things I've had to take care of at home, and you want to make sure that employee is rewarded for putting in extra time, both just as a good team management practice, also because that person's skills are so valuable that she should get that extra compensation. Nothing prevents you from varying up the rules in ways that are more favorable to employees than the rule requires. you could not enter into an agreement that denies overtime to somebody for whom it's otherwise mandatory. So, for example, if somebody earns $20,000 a year, you could not enter into a contract that forbids that person from receiving overtime because that's less favorable to the employee than the rule requires. But if you want to enter into a private agreement that's more favorable than the rule requires, you will always have that option. So just to quickly recap, an HCE, or highly compensated employee, is somebody who is over the threshold where they're generally not going to be eligible for overtime. As of today, it's $100,000 a year. In California, New York, et cetera, it's a little bit different. But nationwide, it's $100,000 right now. Starting on January 1st, that number is going to be about $107,000, where people who earn more than that in their salary plus 10% of their other compensation will generally not be eligible for overtime.
All right, thank you. Thanks again, Chris. You were extremely thorough today, and you provided us a lot of information that our audience will be sure to take home and hopefully apply this in their workplaces. So we want to thank you for that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for questions, and we've got tons of good questions. So I want to ensure the audience that we're going to be passing on your questions along to Chris. He will be answering them, and we'll get those responses back out to you. In addition to that, we'll be providing the presentation that you've seen today. And also we have some tools for our subscribers, our valued subscribers, that we will be providing for you, so that way you can implement the information you've seen today in your workplaces. So thank you again, Chris, for taking the time to answer those questions, and thank you to everyone that submitted them. It's much appreciated.
Okay, we enjoy hosting webinars for our valued customers, and as such, we would really appreciate your feedback. Please stick around for a couple of minutes as a brief survey will open up for you to rate what you saw and heard today. We hope that you found this information useful in understanding the final overtime rule and knowing what to do to prepare prior to its effective date. Thanks again to Christopher for being our guest panelist. We look forward to continuing to work with Christopher on future presentations. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we invite you to view past webinars on demand at the link provided on the screen. To all of our attendees, thank you for choosing Personnel Concepts as your provider of workplace compliance solutions. This concludes today's webinar, and have a good afternoon, everyone.